Welcome back to the Biz-eWerk podcast. This is part 2 of my interview with Albert Churella on the business history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. Al, welcome to the Biz-eWerk podcast.
Well, thank you, Corey, and thanks so much for the opportunity to talk to you and your listeners today.
When you look at the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, how is that industry influenced by what's happening in history, and how is history influenced by what's happening with the Pennsylvania Railroad or railroads in general?
Well, I would say it's not just that it's the Pennsylvania Railroad or railroad history is tied to industrialization. I think it's tied, as you pointed out, to American history in general. And one of the conceits, I guess, when I was writing this book was I said to myself, I want to write a book that, just for fun, I bet somebody teaching an American history course could use this book. And if students read actually all 3 volumes, they would get a reasonably good grounding in American history, at least sort of the business and technological and public policy history of the United States. I don't recommend anybody, if there's any, college professor out there who's teaching earlier modern U.S. history, I don't recommend you do that. But one of the things that people have complimented me on, and I really appreciate it, is that they've said, we really love you, just didn't tell the story of the railroad. You told the context, you explained the
Yeah.
context, because there's so many things. And there's a lot of business history being written, has been written, not so much today, but especially 50 or 100 years ago, that's hagiographic, that's celebratory,
Yeah.
that says Henry Ford did this. Henry Ford made America. Andrew Carnegie made America. He built this company. And this is what lone entrepreneurs, unfettered by government intervention, are able to accomplish if they're just left to their own devices. And let's put up a statue to this person. And okay, I don't deny the influence of entrepreneurship. You can't possibly deny the influence of entrepreneurship in business. But that entrepreneurship is set in a landscape that is shaped very broadly by public policy, but what the government does. When the Pennsylvania Railroad was first chartered in 1846, more than half of its capital came from government entities, from the various districts of the city of Philadelphia, from Allegheny County, which is Pittsburgh, and railroads in general have received all kinds of support from the federal government, local government, state governments, and they exist in a landscape that is structured by public policy. They exist in a landscape of possibilities that are put in motion by the available technology, by what the American people, whether it's the workforce or passengers or customers or the general public who reads newspapers, what they're willing to support and what they're opposed to. And so constantly what you see when you look at the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad are executives who say, can't really do it that way, not going to work. There's some constraints that are going to prevent it, whether it's limited capital, government regulation, public opinion. There are always these factors that influence what executives and employees are able to accomplish.
When you look at the end years of the Pennsylvania Railroad and the long decline, your third volume starts like 1933, I think, up to 1968 with the merger with the New York Central, creating the Penn Central. What are some lessons? I think you pointed out that was the largest bankruptcy when that fails in 72. Was it 72 that the Penn Central goes under?
1970, yeah. It was
70.
it was the largest bankruptcy in American history up until that time. And the Pennsylvania Railroad is a company of superlatives. It was the biggest railroad. It was the biggest corporation. Well, it was that's how I justify writing such a
Yeah,
big book or
I
3 big
agree.
books. But for 20 years in the late 19th century, it was the largest business corporation in the world. It merged with the New York Central in 1968. It was the largest merger in American history up to that point. And then, yes, 2 years later, finished in the bankruptcy, which is the largest bankruptcy in American history. Um, so it is a compelling story just because of the size and the influence, the shock waves that the company sends through the American economy and the American political system and that kind of thing. And uh, if you want to talk about why the Pennsylvania Railroad declined and ultimately failed, we'd be here for the rest of the day. There's so many causal factors, like any disaster. It's not just
Sure,
one thing, it's a
sure.
combination of unfortunate circumstances. But I think, sort of in common with the steam to diesel locomotive story, there are these paradigm shifts.
Yeah.
And one of the big paradigm shifts was at the beginning of the 20th century. Pretty much everybody in the United States, and certainly regulators, whether that's the Interstate Commerce Commission at the national level or state regulatory agencies, they assumed, and I think rightly so, that railroads are the only game in town. That aside from walking or taking a horse and wagon for a short distance, there was simply no way to get a person or a thing from one place to another without it going by rail. And railroad executives internalize this as well. It surprises a lot of people that some executives in the Pennsylvania Railroad and other companies were supporters of the good roads movement, wanted to see highways built, never thinking that they would be competitors to the railroads, but simply that there would be local feeder roads
Hmm.
that would get produce or people a very short distance, small town, to the nearest rail line. And every aspect of regulatory policy was predicated on the assumption that railroads monopolize transportation. And the focus, therefore, was on ensuring that railroads did not engage in destructive competition, that is, destroy one another through their pricing policies, and did not discriminate in an economic sense against people, communities, businesses, that kind of thing. And there was a huge amount of cross subsidization going on. Freight service supported passenger service, traffic on main lines supported traffic on branch lines, and lower rates to small communities were offset by more remunerative rates to larger cities. And nobody ever really considered what would happen if railroads themselves lost their monopoly over transportation, which of course is what happened in the 1920s with highway construction, with automobiles, and already in the mid 20s, the railroads were seeing sharp declines in passenger service and trucks, of course. And the problem was that everybody was sort of stuck in that regulatory paradigm. And the ICC, which at one point was, I think, a very effective regulatory agency, never could quite grapple with this transformation from railroads as a monopoly over transportation to railroads that were being buffeted by other forms of transportation. And that's not necessarily the ICC's fault, right? Because they're taking their instructions from Congress. They have to abide by the various pieces of legislation Congress has passed. But neither they nor railroad executives really coped effectively with this and could never really cope with what needed to be done, which was downsizing. Because downsizing meant layoffs, it meant
Yeah.
communities were going to lose service and so forth. Uh, Passenger trains would be discontinued, all of which had to happen. But nobody, and even though people acknowledged that at kind of the macro level, when it came to their passenger train or their community or their job or whatever, they were absolutely dead set against this. And so it took a kind of massive, sort of fundamental shift in regulatory policy, which is a related but in some ways separate issue, that brought about the revitalization of the railroads that we see today.
Do you feel like when you look at the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, and we've hit the negative, let's hit on the positive. I grew up in South Central PA. The Pennsylvania Railroad is still there. I was in Philly a couple of weeks ago. I'm sitting in traffic underneath the railroad bridge, and right above is a big Pennsylvania Railroad stamp. Still in use, trains going across, cars underneath. When you think about the legacy and the history of the Pennsylvania Railroad, high-tech company for its day, lasted for over 100 years. What do you consider to be the most significant, the greatest contribution still today from the Pennsylvania Railroad?
Hard to say what the single greatest contribution is. I think in a very specific, if you look at just the Pennsylvania Railroad, it's the infrastructure, some of which you mentioned. So if you go, for example, on the Amtrak's Northeast Corridor between Washington and New York, that's the Pennsylvania Railroad. It's been upgraded, modernized, but the route is essentially the same, which is not necessarily a good thing because some of that dates to the 1830s and 40s. So it's
Right.
hard to kind of superimpose a Shinkansen or
Yeah.
TJV high-speed rail on a 150 or now almost 200-year-old infrastructure. But that's the Pennsylvania Railroad. Um, you go underneath the Hudson River into Penn Station. Penn Station is now sadly gone, but the tunnels, the tracks, those were built by the Pennsylvania Railroad during the administration of President Alexander Cassatt, who oversaw this kind of massive burst of physical improvements during the early 20th century, built to last. And these were one of the things that railroad executives complain is that investment bankers, people who running hedge funds and retirement funds and so on, money managers, they want to see quarterly returns. How you're doing this quarter, how much can you cut costs to goose profits and that kind of thing. And railroad executives say, look, we operate on 20 and 30-year timelines. And Cassatt was working on probably 100-year timeline. He said these investments will never, they're never going to earn anything like a reasonable rate of return. But they're investments we have to make in anticipation of what he thought would be sustained growth in railroad traffic over the next 100 years. And so that rail infrastructure is there. It's vital. I can't even think about how difficult it would be at this point given even using eminent domain laws,
Yeah,
given political opposition, NIMBYism, and so forth,
sure.
to from scratch build an entirely new rail system across the United States. We're still looking at the legacy. Almost no new track has been laid in the past 100 years. And so we're inheritors of the legacy of that railroad system, that right of way, that network of corridors. And I think anybody who's in business today, anybody who works for a hierarchical organization, a corporate organization, in some ways, a good portion of what they do is the legacy of what the railroads developed 150 or so years ago as they were struggling to become the first entities, aside from perhaps the military, that were capable of managing large, complex, and geographically diffuse organizations. And we take that as commonplace today, but this was such a new thing in the kind of mid 1800s.
You think that's maybe the best takeaway from your research is that these organizations and Pennsylvania Railroad in particular, but not just the Pennsylvania Railroad, we're the Union Pacific, the Southern Pacific, the New York Central, these great railroad history lines, legacy lines. You think that's the best takeaway that they really invented what we think of as modern management technique?
Well, there's a whole discussion in the academic literature about who borrowed what
Who
from
did
whom.
that?
And some people say it was the railroads who came up with a modern system of management. Others say that they ripped off is the wrong phrase, but that they selectively adapted a lot of the techniques that the U.S. military used and so forth. And there are good arguments to be made either way. Um, but I think very quickly, even to the extent that the railroads borrowed from the military, they very quickly came to understand that there were unique circumstances associated with railroad transportation that were very different from what happened in the U.S. military. And so they came up with these organizational methods, incorporated technology. Of course, the military does too. The military relies on technology a lot, more so today than in the 19th century, but they adopted technological solutions to ensure efficient and safe operations. Um, Often, and there's a fascinating story here about the extent to which railroads uh, welcomed or at least acquiesced to the installation of safety appliances like air brakes and automatic couplers and so on, in part because of the broader regulatory context. That is, the government saying you must install these devices to keep employees and the public, traveling public, safe. But what happened was the railroads began to appreciate that those kinds of safety appliances had a great benefit and they made operations more efficient. Longer trains, faster trains, fewer derailments, less damage to cargo, and so forth. And that only incidentally were these safety appliances going to accomplish what their name suggested, and that is make travel safer. And so it was an interesting sort of way in which the railroads decided to become safer as an ancillary to their primary focus, which was to become more profitable.
Al, I appreciate you taking the time to talk about this today. I know there's so many other topics that you've briefly touched on that we could do entire episodes on, but I really was just excited to speak to you about this series of books and especially the business connection and the history connection with a great American railroad, Pennsylvania Railroad. So thank you very much for taking the time today.
Well, thank you, Corey. It's been wonderful to talk to you.
Thank you for listening to the Biz-eWerk podcast and my interview with Al Churella, author of a 3-volume history of the Pennsylvania Railroad. I'll share links to the books in the episode description. Biz-eWerk, helping you mind your business history. I'll catch you next time.